The honourable member for Dartmouth East on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the day the Minister of Energy actually answers the question he's asked and not gives a propaganda message from a briefing note. Mr. Speaker, currently before the URB, the URB is currently reviewing information regarding efficiency in Nova Scotia and the rate of the NDP electricity tax, and the evidence provided suggests a large portion of the savings achieved in Nova Scotia is actually not related to activities by Efficiency Nova Scotia. It has been suggested at the hearings already that the DSM rate should be frozen until Efficiency Nova Scotia maximizes their efforts under the current budget. Given the increases announced this afternoon, will the minister agree to legislate a freeze to the Efficiency Nova Scotia charge for 2012?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, it's not a tax that's on the energy efficiency. It's really, you know, a prudent investment for ratepayers to lower their cost in the long term, and it's going to work because there's a lot of good programs there. But we'll certainly hope that Nova Scotia Power can work to look at their costs and see, you know, what reductions or what can be done, and you know, and if really something that could be done to help would be, as the province did, the federal government also would take the HST off of electricity.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on your final supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the minister can talk all he wants about HST reduction and so forth, but the fact is that's long been wiped out, and the fact is we're now well beyond that point, and the rates are much higher than they were when they took power. So, Mr. Speaker, the fact, and then the NDP added their own tax to wipe it out anyway, so it doesn't matter. A tax the Premier opposed in opposition. Mr. Speaker, last time Nova Scotia Power threatened to raise rates, the NDP put the health of Nova Scotians and the environment at risk by relaxing mercury regulations, and rates still increased. So, Mr. Speaker, my final question is to the Minister of the Environment. What environmental protection does the minister plan to throw out this time to cave into Nova Scotia Power?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To the member opposite, we take this very seriously. We made the adjustments. We're going to meet our goals. We have been recognized across North America for our ambitious goals in this. And we are taking in consideration the people that's most vulnerable, and we made the right adjustments, and we're going to meet our goal. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. Mr. Speaker, the Executive Director of Hants Regional Development Authority was dismissed without cause. No one knows why he was let go, not even the former Executive Director, and not those who serve on the West Hants Council. The West Hants Council is very concerned about this issue, and as the funding partners deserve an answer. My question is, has the Minister met with the Warden or any members of the Hants West Council to investigate this particular matter?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and through you, I want to thank the member opposite for that particular question. And I can say this is I have met with the RDA, had an in-camera session with the board of the RDA in Windsor a number of weeks ago, and they explained to me the circumstances surrounding a human resource issue. Mr. Speaker, I was completely satisfied with what I heard from that board, and I did send a copy on not only to the warden but also to a council member, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Preston on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the West Hants Council asked the minister to investigate concerns with the HRDA as far back as January. Yet the councillor, Randy Matheson, states that the minister chose not to meet with their wardens or other stakeholders, and I will table an op-ed article here that the councillor lays that out. By all accounts, the board and the RDA did not follow proper procedures when they dismissed the executive director without cause. Yet the minister is quoted as saying in a letter dated March 15th, quote, due process has been adhered to, and a quote, and I'll also table that letter. My question is, how can the minister be satisfied that due process was followed when the minister neglected to meet with the warden and stakeholders?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the member opposite for bringing this forward. And since he's in the business of tabling things, Mr. Speaker, I have a couple of letters here. One from a councillor, the municipality of the district of West Hants, and another one from the municipality for the District of West Hants, and my responses to those letters, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a human resource issue, and I do know, Mr. Speaker, for a fact that the municipality of West Hants, as were all the municipalities, were offered an in-camera session by the RDA to discuss the reasons why this human resource issue came forward. And unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, some of the municipalities refused that invitation.
The Honourable Member for Preston, on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the answer from the minister, but the warden of West Hants still has not received a reply as late as today at 2:45. Mr. Speaker, the council members are disappointed with the lack of concern the minister has shown over this issue. They asked for leadership from the minister and got nothing in return. Mr. Speaker, the council is very upset in the way that the RDA handled the matter. The council has voted to withdraw financial support from the RDA. Well, my question to the minister is, will the minister confirm whether the RDA will have to shut down now that part of the funding will be removed by the municipalities?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I could stand up here for some time and give you a response to that answer. However, I will not do that. But what I will say to that member opposite, that during estimates, I would invite him to ask me that question during estimates, and I will give him a thorough explanation as to what's going on there. And talk about leadership, Mr. Speaker, I can say this, that I've had calls from mayors and councillors in Hants, congratulating me on the leadership that I've shown on this issue, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Agriculture. After watching what this government has done to the forestry industry and the pharmacy industry, people in the agricultural industry were concerned that this government would cut the Farm Investment Fund. The minister said on April 8th that he was looking for a $500,000 rollout of the department's 10-year agricultural strategy. Farmers want to know where the Farm Investment Fund fits into this strategy for fiscal 2011-12. Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of farmers still in the dark, including the president of the Kings County Federation of Agriculture, as to whether the Farm Investment Fund is or is not in the strategy. Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the minister, how long before this minister will provide concrete details to all farmers in the province about the agricultural strategy?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I actually met with council leaders. We explained to them the budget and the impacts of the budget. Farm Investment Fund for this year is really the same as last year, Mr. Speaker. One of the issues that has caused the biggest concern is some years ago the farming community actually wanted to be able to apply for 2 years of funding in the program. So most of the funding for this year in the Farm Investment Fund is already booked because of applications for last year. They got 2 years of funding. So also along with that, the name of that fund will disappear going forward. We're doing a reorg of programs, but certainly the areas that they could apply for in the fund, some of those areas will still be there, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that's just about as unclear an answer as we could expect. Mr. Speaker, the President of the Kings County Federation of Agriculture is certainly unclear about the department's land drainage program. Has the minister eliminated assistance altogether, or is this another component of the Farm Investment Fund which has been inadequately explained?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For anyone who applied to the fund for the 2 years for land drainage, then those applications would still be in place for this year, but there'll be no room for new applicants because the people who applied last year got funding, and that was 2-year funding. So, Mr. Speaker, so yes, the fund is still in place. People are still using it, but basically it's been applied for. So.
The honourable member for Hants West on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister said last week during the estimates that funding had been increased actually for the Farm Investment Fund. Will the minister table in this House of Assembly this afternoon a copy of the proposed changes to the Farm Investment Fund and the added dollars it has received?
The honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Actually, funding in the department has gone up by, I think, nearly $1 million, Mr. Speaker, and actually in about 4 different programs, but I'm thinking it didn't go up in the Farm Investment Fund.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. And my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. The Ross report provided a series of recommendations for government action when it comes to accessing emergency room care. But like many issues being considered by this government, they have chosen to focus on addressing silos instead of recognizing that the entire system needs to be fixed to address smooth patient flow. And a case in point is the Dartmouth General Hospital. There is no hope of the Dartmouth General reaching Dr. Ross's recommended emergency room standard, which states that no admitted patient should stay in the emergency room longer than 24 hours after the initial triage. And as an example, 3 patients have been waiting for longer than 2 days for almost this entire week just to go through the system. So will the minister support the recommendation of the Dartmouth General to open the 5th floor as a way to ensure the facility is able to meet the Dr. Ross standard?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, we're very well aware of the pressures that staff are under at the Dartmouth General Hospital in their ER, and the Capital District Health Authority and the Department of Health continue to look at what options might be available to dealing with this very difficult situation, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister knows some of the solutions. I've been talking about the 5th floor for almost 2 years, and the Dartmouth General has submitted plans to the minister about the 5th floor. Here is the reality. On most days, true emergency cases, level 2 patients, are triaged, admitted, treated, and discharged several days later, all from the emergency department. This does nothing for patient flow, and although the minister has talked about changes throughout the QE2, the Dartmouth General needs attention in this too, and that's why it can't be just silos. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister review the business case and realize that opening the 5th floor will save money and allow the Dartmouth General to meet Dr. Ross's standard and provide better patient care?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think everybody recognizes that there are many, many needs in our healthcare system, and you can't do everything at once, Mr. Speaker. Choices have to be made. The choice this government made was to start with the tertiary care centre at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, where we expanded the number of general medicine beds, and we introduced a rapid assessment unit, which has diverted literally several thousand people from the emergency department, taking pressure off that department. Mr. Speaker, we, in our budget, have money to further expand the hours of operation at the Cobequid Centre. And at the same time, we are addressing the difficulties in rural communities around the province with the opening of collaborative emergency centres, the first one we've announced for the community of Parsborough, Mr. Speaker. So we are very aware of the situation at the Dartmouth General, and we continue to work closely with the Capital District Health Authority with respect to what are the measures that we might be able to take to ease the pressures off that particular emergency department, Mr. Speaker?
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's not about what the solutions are. The Dartmouth General, the staff and the doctors and the board there have been telling the minister and her department for a couple of years what the solution is, and the space is available, no new building is required, no major renovations are required, and the fact is today's stats are typical. There are 3 patients waiting in the ER waiting to be admitted, this coupled with 14 patients at the QE2 today waiting to be admitted. Mr. Speaker, given that opening the 5th floor of the Dartmouth General Hospital would not be classified as a major capital project, why the delay?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think I adequately responded to that question the last time. We have some priorities. We cannot do everything at once. We have a plan, and we are systematically going about implementing that plan. Mr. Speaker, the Capital District Health Authority opened an urgent care practice in Dartmouth to take pressure off the Dartmouth General Hospital, and we will continue to take steps with the Capital District Health Authority to address the urgent pressures that are on all of our emergency departments throughout this District Health Authority, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. How much funding has been cut from the RIM budget for Hants West, and how does that compare to RIM cuts in other constituencies across the province?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal.
Mr. Speaker, you know, I'm prepared to answer those types of questions during estimates. I ask for a ruling on this. If you wish me to continue, I shall.
No, go ahead, Minister. No.
Well, let's talk about RIM money in particular. And I think that all members of this House, well, certainly the rural members who are important, we understand when it comes to RIM dollars, we're aware of the fact that there have to be certain local projects that don't make a list, they're not in the 5-year plan, but those particular projects, and I know the member from Digby-Annapolis has one in particular he always brings to my attention, those particular projects are going to be addressed. There is an actual number that I can quote at a further time, but I want the members of this House to know that we have another very busy schedule ahead of us. I met recently with a number of representatives from the Truckers Association concerned about the 80-20 rule, making sure that they were aware that they should be ready because there's going to be lots of work for them. There's going to be lots of work for them locally, and I want members of the House to know that that consideration is always there when it comes to local jobs.
The honourable member for Hants West on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity for the minister to answer the questions as the estimates are winding down. We may not have all the time that we would like to have with that minister. So through you to the minister, when will Hants West see the results of the paving and chip sealing initiative your government has directly undertaken in competition with traditional road building companies?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I guess I sort of thank the member for the question. Some of the specifics that you're asking about at this time, particularly in the legislative session that we're in, the QP that we're going through today, would be more appropriate for estimates, and those types of questions and the specifics will be provided when, and hopefully we have the opportunity to answer these questions.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Hants West on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I know this question is in reference to the 101, and I know that the minister, actually, and the member for King South would also support me in this, I'm sure, as this highway is making its way down toward her constituency. When will we see, through you to the minister, when will we see tenders called for further work on Highway 101, whether they're for the structures that need to be built or the actual road building?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, and thank you to the member opposite for this question. We all know of the long-standing battle on the 101 and the importance that it is to the community, and I want that member to know on that side of the House, that members on this side of the House constantly point up the fact that the 101 is of real importance economically and for safety reasons in the community. When we look at, and I want to thank the member from Kings North who recently, last July, in fact, if I remember the date, opened a portion of the 101. The other thing that's of real importance, of course, the 101 are the climbing lanes, making sure that there are so-called passing lanes. I prefer to call them climbing lanes as opposed to encouraging people to speed up. The 101 is an important part of the highway system of this province. Safety remains a #1 priority for this government and this particular minister. The 101 will be taken care of. The people of the valley should be reassured. The 101 will not be forgotten.
The honourable member for The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, we've written an extra 5 during question period. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, on April 29, 2010, government announced a new act to manage and develop the fur industry in Nova Scotia. An excellent initiative, Mr. Speaker, and one that we support, but it's been nearly a year.
Order, please. The time for oral questions put by members to Minister is over. I will now recognize the host leader of the Progressive Conservative Party to call business.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We will call private and local bills for second reading.
Private and local bills, second reading.
Can you call bill number 3?
Bill number 3.
You're good. Yes.
The honourable leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am honoured, actually, to rise and move second reading of Bill number 3, the Modernizing Government Act. Mr. Speaker, the most important thing we do in these jobs that we have as MLAs is to work for the people of our ridings and collectively to the people of Nova Scotia. This bill is very important to me and to the PC caucus. In fact, I will point out that this is our first opposition day in this session where we can call bills, and in fact, this is the first bill of our first opposition day that we've chosen to call. This is the very earliest moment we could actually call the bill, and I just say that as an indication to all members of the House as to the importance that we place to Bill number 3, the Modernizing Government Act. I think, Mr. Speaker, that we all have a duty in this House, obviously first to our constituents, but we also have a duty to the political system to make it relevant, to make it accountable, to make it accessible, and to make it fair so that Nova Scotians can have some confidence that the decisions that are made in this chamber and that the decisions that are made on their behalf are the best decisions that could possibly be made. And so I would just like to begin my few minutes on Bill number 3 by explaining to the House through you, Madam Speaker, the importance that we place on this, because it's a sad fact that as...
Order, please. I'd just like to remind folks that the chatter's getting a little high in here. It's difficult to hear. If I could just be mindful of that, please. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is a sad fact that too many Nova Scotians have turned their backs on our political system, that too many are frustrated by all that has gone on here and elsewhere in politics, that too many feel that we aren't dealing with issues that are important to them, that too many feel that there is game playing and manipulation and jockeying for position when we should be working together on issues like jobs and the economy and health care and our schools and our kids. And Madam Chair, it is difficult in an environment where there is that much cynicism to convince people to turn back around and engage with their politicians, engage with our system of government so that we can make the best decisions possible. If there's one thing that I heard as I crossed the province in the past year many times, running for the leadership of my party, first of all, and as I crossed the wonderful constituency of Cumberland South, running for a seat in this very place, it's that people don't see that the work that is being done here is relevant to today's problems or relevant to today's families. And so the primary purpose of Bill number 3, the Modernizing Government Act, is to focus the work of the legislature on modern problems, on modern issues, on things that are important to people. Madam Chair, that starts with ensuring that people see that MLAs are subject to the same rules as everyone else. That although in one way MLAs are elected and placed at the top of the political pyramid, that in fact, just like in business, we have a boss, and our boss is the people. This is a principle that I can borrow for a moment from the credit union system where I come from, that I was the CEO of the credit union, but still the many, many thousands of members of my credit union elected a board of directors to oversee the pay and benefits of their CEO. I had a boss. Through that board, my boss was the people who were the members of the credit union. I say this to all members of this House, but I say this in particular to the members on the government side, many of whom I know are credit union members. And I say this in the hopes of reminding them of their social democratic roots so they can see the principles that are behind this bill. The wisdom, for example, of setting up a panel of citizens to take the thorny issue of pay and benefits and pensions out of the hands of MLAs who, after all, are the very beneficiaries of those decisions, and give them to our boss to decide, the people themselves, like happens at my credit union. I am hopeful that the NDP members who are members of their own credit unions will see the wisdom, be reminded of the roots, and support the bill. For that reason, that just like in the credit union, we have to be always mindful that there is someone else out there who is truly in charge. And in our system of democracy, there is one rung higher on that great pyramid, and that is where the people themselves reside. And that is why the bill creates, in law, a panel of citizens who will have all the resources they need. They can hire all the expertise they need to do their job, to determine what is fair pay, what are fair benefits, what is a fair pension for their MLAs. There are other provinces that have this same system. I wish the Government of Canada would have this same system so that we don't need to spend time in this House defending decisions we make for ourselves, which is wrong. We can spend our time on things that people pay us to spend our time on, like jobs, the economy, healthcare, schools, and so on. This is one of the most important principles I could bring from the credit union system to this great House of Assembly, is to take those issues out of our hands and put them where they belong, in the hands of our bosses, in the hands of the people. The other thing, Madam Chair, that the bill does, which I think is very important, is it puts in the hands of the people the power to force the legislature to focus on issues that are important to them. Every MLA in this chamber, no matter how long they've been here, can do their own assessment of how we spend our time when we're sitting in this chamber. How much time do we really spend on the great issues and the great challenges and the great opportunities that our province faces? And how much time do we spend on other things, on the resolutions, on question period, on bills that are not focused on the things that people want us to focus on? We should imagine that behind that TV camera is a Nova Scotian watching every minute, keeping track of what we spend our time doing. That is, I think, the right way for us to imagine. Or that the gallery is full of our mothers and fathers and grandparents watching us in action. How much time would they want us to spend on the things we do spend our time on? How much time would they want us to spend in true debate, in true discussion, in true dialogue, and things that are important to them? Now, we leave it to ourselves to decide how we allocate our time. And I would just hold out, Madam Speaker, that we haven't done a very good job of that. We in the past have not done a very good job of that. That Nova Scotians tell us consistently, one-on-one, and in groups, and in polls, and in petitions to the legislature, that there are other issues that are important to them. One is going to come up this afternoon, and I want to give credit to the member to my left, the member for Victoria, on grandparents' rights. A very direct result of a strong level of petitioning by an important segment of our society. to bring this forward. It's come from many places. And we'll talk about that when we get to the bill. I fully agree with what the member is saying. This is not a partisan or a political issue. Of course, absolutely, I agree with that. We're of like mind on this. It's an example of doing the right thing, regardless of party. There are too few examples of that, actually, Madam Speaker. That is the point. That the people who are our bosses can force the legislature, when they see it veering off course, when they see it veering into the ditch of partisanship, or into the ditch of irrelevancy, or into the ditch of bickering, where we should be debating big issues, and force us through petition to bring forward legislation to deal with the issues that are important to them, that are important to today's families, whether it's grandparents' rights, or whether it's health care, whether it's emergency room access, whether it's our schools and the special needs kids and the services that we provide to them and the way we pay for those services, or whether it's jobs and the economy and how a government can sometimes help the economy along and how sometimes the government has to get out of the way to allow the economy to move. These are things that people want us to work on. This is a way through this bill to give Nova Scotians the opportunity to force the legislature to focus on the job that they want done. I should also add, Madam Chair, that when we look at declining rates of voting and so on, I think that we must make sure that we do all we can to increase the accessibility of participation in our democracy, which is ultimately expressed through voting in elections, to make that as easy and transparent and fair as possible. That is why a modern government has fixed election dates, like 7 provinces in Canada do, like all of the other Atlantic Canadian provincial peers do, like the government of Canada does, like many jurisdictions in democracies like ours around the world do. This should be a matter of law. And that when that time comes that we go to the polls, that we have a person of disability on the Election Commission to make sure we're doing all we can to expand access to those polls. That is why we should leave it to Nova Scotians themselves by limiting third-party advertising during elections. Leave it to Nova Scotians themselves to make up their own minds about who their government should be. These are the things that we can do to bring the government of Nova Scotia into the 21st century, to create that modern, dynamic, 21st century government that we all want, so that all those that have turned their backs on our system can turn right back around again and become engaged system. We all have a duty that is our first duty before we get to parties. That is our first duty, to do all we can to make that true once again in our province. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Speaker.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise today on behalf of our government to speak to Bill 3, the Modernizing Government Act, which was first introduced by the member of Cumberland South. I would like to begin by discussing what I believe modernization means. To be modern, you must embrace change, you must never cling to the status quo, and you must always strive for something better. Madam Speaker, I believe I'm part of a modern government, and since being elected in 2009, we've made the right decisions for Nova Scotian families. Madam Speaker, the Modernizing Government Act is very broad, including items like changes to Nova Scotia elections, which of course fall under the Elections Act. Madam Speaker, I want to begin my discussion today by talking about the issues that are always in the minds of Nova Scotians, and that is health care. For generations, we've watched our health care system erode. We have all watched doctors, nurses, and technicians, staff and volunteers in our health system grow frustrated, and Madam Speaker, rightfully so. And so, Madam Speaker, we brought about better care sooner for health care system. With the support and wisdom of Dr. John Ross, our government has begun to take steps needed to deliver health care the way Nova Scotians need and want it. Several days ago, the Premier and our Minister of Health and Wellness announced the location of the new Nova Scotia, and in fact Canada's first, collaborative emergency care. In July, the people of Parsborough and surrounding area, which interestingly enough, Madam Speaker, is also the constituency of Cumberland South, will open a new chapter in health care. With the opening of the new CEC, the current collaborative practice already established in Parsboro will have extended hours. That means health care when you need it, where you need it, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Madam Speaker, our government knows that it was time for fundamental change of our health care system, and that is now. And may I say that the purpose of this debate that we are modernizing health care delivery. Our government recognizes the talent and skills of our healthcare professionals and people who, day in and day out, care for others when they are in need. In these professions, like the many trained nurses, paramedics, and those who are called upon by doctors to ensure better health care is delivered sooner. In the weeks and months ahead, we will hear more from the Minister of Health and Wellness about areas of the province that will benefit from this new, modern health care delivery. In fact, Madam Speaker, our government will open at least 4 CECs in communities across the province. And I am proud that the CECs fulfill our NDP government's commitment to keeping emergency rooms open. That is a commitment we made to the people of Nova Scotia, and it is one that means a great deal to our people. The Better Care Sooner plan is addressing long waits in the busiest of emergency rooms. Since last fall, almost 1,200 patients headed for the Halifax Infirmary emergency room were diverted to the Rapid Assessment Unit. Also, advanced care paramedics are being trained for immediately giving life-saving drugs to Nova Scotians having heart attacks. Madam Speaker, our government will keep introducing more ways to have better care sooner and make lives better for Nova Scotian families. But Madam Speaker, it is not just health and wellness where our government is making modern changes happen. The most recent budget will improve Nova Scotians' spending power with a personal income tax reduction of $11 million through an increase of basic personal...
Order, please. The honourable member for Argyle.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. Just wondering where that has anything to do with the Act that is before us today. Normally we're speaking to the Act, not about 100 other things. I'm sure the government would say the same thing to us if we were debating in this manner.
Thank you very much. If the member could carry on with her debate in recognizing that the bill is on Bill number 3 on modernizing government. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm certainly talking about modernizing government, which is what the bill is about. Madam Speaker, this means hundreds of the poorest Nova Scotians will no longer pay income tax. Earlier this month, the Premier and the Minister of Community Services announced one of the biggest single investments in
Order,
families
please.
And children.
The honourable member for Lunenburg has the floor.
And one of the fundamental principles that our government has put forward is that Nova Scotians want to be independent and provide for their families. We want to keep families and break out of the cycle of poverty. People on income assistance, including those with disabilities, can now keep more of the money that they earn. Working income assistance clients will keep up to 30% more.
Order, please. The honourable member for Argyle has the floor.
So far in the speech,
Sorry,
Speaker,
I recognize the honourable member for Argyle.
Thank you. I haven't heard anything speaking to the bill, which is Bill 3, which talks about a number of things. I'm not going to go over them, but if she's not going to be speaking to this, then maybe we can move on to the next speaker.
One moment, please, while I confer with the clerk, please.
None of the clauses that are involved are being discussed here. None of the points. That's not fair. You guys would be at us.
Order, please. I would just remind the member that the bill is Bill number 3, modernizing government, and I would just ask that you try to focus your comments on the principles of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And the bill that's being introduced is talking about modernizing the government, and that's exactly what I'm speaking to, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, our government has been steadily increasing the number of childcare subsidies across the province, and this year we've achieved our election commitment to add 250 more subsidies for child spaces. We're modernizing childcare and modernizing government. Madam Speaker, I am so proud that we have launched one of the most comprehensive action plans in the history of the government to modernize and improve services for families living with autism. Until now, about half of the children who are living with autism will now use the early intervention behavioral system the program at the IWK hospital has received. This will transform and modernize the whole way of working with people for families with children in autism. Children were being randomly selected to gain or lose. Now this is not happening. We have modernized this entire approach to families living with autism. And children with autism will soon have access to the best treatment as early as possible to give them a real chance for success. And that, Madam Speaker, is modernizing. Yeah. This program will work to improve the functioning skill, including communication skills, social skills, and behaviors, so that children with autism can have better communication and interact with their families, classmates, and communities. Our government knows that lowering financial barriers to post-secondary education is also a very modern approach to education for our young students. We are investing $42.5 million in student assistance this year. We are investing $30 million in student bursaries and modernizing the approach by providing tuition reduction to students. We are also creating a debt cap in the first one in the province's history, and I would call that revolutionary or incredibly modern. Nova Scotian graduates will be able to reduce. It's a better deal for Nova Scotia students. In addition, our government is keeping its commitment to having more students stay in Nova Scotia and put down roots here. Our modern graduate retention rebate is now providing a tax credit for up to $15,000 for university graduates and $7,500 for community college graduates paid over 6 years. Madam Speaker, the way of our youth will learn to live and grow and evolve here in the province. We as government have a responsibility to ensure that the way we provide assistance follows suit. And Madam Speaker, I believe you could say that we are modernizing post-secondary education.
Order, please. I recognize the honourable member for Argyle.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I'm going to try this for a third time. And I'm sure, through your work that you can ensure that she's to the principles of the bill that are before us, not reading from a prepared speech from her caucus. I'm just wondering if we can really get to the principles of the bill that are before us, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Before I make my comments to the member, I don't think it's really for anyone other than the member to make a decision about how she delivers her comments, whether it be through a speech or through off the cuff, as any member in the room has that option. But I would remind the member in the remaining minute or so that you have to speak to the principles of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Could you tell me how much?
The honourable member for Lunenburg.
Thank you, Madam. Could you tell me how much time I have?
1 minute.
Pardon? 1 minute? Well, Madam Speaker, the bill called today by the member of Cumberland South is called the Modernizing Government Act, and I have spoken in broad strokes about the importance of modern government. But I've done so because we believe that our government has made many changes necessary to the modernization of government in Nova Scotia. Also, Mr. Speaker, our government would want to ensure that if such an act were to come forward, it would need review, something with such broad scope that Nova Scotians would have a chance to have their say about and proper consultation was conducted. So, Madam Speaker, the voice of Nova Scotians echoes through each piece of legislation our government brings to this historic chamber, and we initiate the launch of communities. Madam Speaker, each change made from our government is to make life better for Nova Scotians. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I wonder if I get a prepared statement from a researcher and read that, whether I'll get a standing ovation too, and talk about nothing, and talk about very little, related to the bill, I might add. You know, Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and speak about this bill. Actually, it's an interesting bill because it includes a whole lot of ideas that the Liberal Party has introduced as bills in previous sessions, including in sessions under the previous Tory government where they refused to support them. So I'm glad that they've seen the light on the road to Damascus and now are supporting the ideas that they could have actually voted in favor of when they were in government, and they would be law now. But you know, better late than never, I guess, to the party. You know, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, I'd like to talk about a few of these ideas. There are, as I said, there's a number of very good ideas. In terms, and I'd like to go through some of them one by one. For example, appointing someone, requiring the Governor and Council to appoint someone with a disability to the Elections Commission makes eminent sense. In terms of requiring all polling stations to be accessible, it's always, and I certainly stand to be corrected, but it is my understanding from the, Madam Speaker.
Order, please. The honourable member for Dartmouth East has the floor.
The member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island will be happy to know that, unlike the government caucus, I will actually speak to the bill and am speaking to the bill. And maybe next time, if they read the bill, they'll be able to speak to it.
You should be aware that his next move is out the door. Look how close he got to the food now.
Madam Speaker, this is there's a number of elements. There's a number of elements to this bill which I think are very important, including in terms of requiring polling stations to be accessible. It's my understanding, actually, from the Election Commission that's already a requirement. But if there's a benefit in entrenching it in legislation, that's fine. And certainly, it's not something I would oppose. I would hope nobody would oppose such a thing. Fixed election dates, of course. You know, we introduced a bill when the Progressive Conservatives were in government to do exactly that. The Progressive Conservatives at the time turn that bill down. One would hope it's not treated like Stephen Harper treats fixed election dates when he introduced a bill to do exactly the same and then called an election. So it has to actually have some teeth to it to make sure that that happens. But I think that it makes a lot of sense. It brings certainty to the election process, and regardless of which party is in power, it ensures that elections are not called based on the best poll dates, but instead are called on a predictable timescale. Third-party advertising is something that we've been talking about for quite a long time, and something we've expressed some concern about. We've introduced legislation on this issue, and a number of times we've made submissions to the Elections Commission, and it's something we absolutely support. We believe it's supported by the Supreme Court and rulings that the court has made on the limiting of third-party advertising, and certainly it's something that we find very important. I would like to spend a little bit of time to talk about the issue of petitions. The member for Halifax Clayton Park has spoken frequently about the issue of electronic petitions. I know it's been an issue in other locations as well, and currently I think we all recognize that they're not accepted here. I know, in fact, there was a relatively large petition brought forward by the member from Inverness, which was on a very important issue, one of fracking. Unfortunately, it couldn't be accepted here because it was an electronic petition. And I'm not sure that that's something that I have a lot of concern about that, because I recognize that there are concerns around somebody from Texas or Oklahoma signing a petition, but at the end of the day, petitions represent an indication of concern, and it's up to the, there are 52 members of the legislature who are all smart enough to look at a petition and determine how they feel about the relative merits and those who signed it. And 52 members will have reasonable differences of opinion in terms of how they weight that petition, and I don't think it would be any different with an electronic petition than any other petition. So I certainly agree with the member for Clayton Park, and I assume the member for Inverness supports them too, because he had brought one here in the last session, which I know we all had hoped could have been accepted. I'm told that the current speaker would look into that, but it keeps having to go back to this House of Assembly or Assembly Matters Committee, which is, I'm told, hasn't met since 2006. And so we keep referring things when we want to change things in the governance of this House to Assembly Matters, which is a committee that hasn't met in 5 years. It seems a little bit crazy. So one of the things that you know, could be preeminent in moving forward with the modernization of the legislature and government is to actually have the committee that's responsible for it meet once. There's a number of, I think, I'm told actually, Madam Speaker, the last time they met was to deal with the issue of putting this, the metal detectors in downstairs, which I don't doubt was an important issue at the time, but I understand there's half a dozen issues that are now sitting before that committee waiting to go. And I think that that's worthy of some discussion. I'd also, when it comes to petitions, I'd like to talk about this issue of, you know, having a petition presented with 10,000 signatures and then forcing a debate on it. I'm not opposed to the idea, but what does that do? The two questions it raises for me are what does that do to the petitions that have 6,000 people? Are they less important? But of course, you don't want to force a debate on any petition that comes. And I understand that the Progressive Conservatives have chosen a number that they feel is valuable. But I took some time earlier today and just looked at the past couple of sessions to see what there's been emergency debates called on. And a lot of them were on petitions that had some of them had petitions, and there were very small numbers in those petitions. George's Bank was one that we had an emergency debate on last year, for example. There was one in, if I do it in more recent time, the Yarmouth Ferry. You know, the issue of the Yarmouth Ferry was a critical and remains a critical issue for Nova Scotians, in particular people in Southwest Nova. And you know, we had an emergency debate on that about a year ago, actually, March 26, 2010. And so I would not want to take away the importance of members having that ability. And the question is, why can't a member now, if they have a petition with 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000, ask for an emergency debate? They can, of course, and they can also call it for late debate and all those sorts of things. So it's unclear to me exactly what this adds. I'm not opposed to it, but I'm not sure exactly what it adds, since, of course, any party can ask for this at any time. And some of the other examples of ones we've had, of course, on the H1N1 pandemic, which the Minister of Health and Wellness participated in. The NSCC strikes was one that we did an emergency debate on, and so forth. So there is a history of addressing those issues which come forward. And in every one of those cases, the number of people that were involved were actually less than 10,000. So I'm not entirely sure what we're trying to add. But again, I'm not opposed to adding that openness. It certainly makes some sense. As a matter of fact, we could, if we were going to go down that route, and I'll throw this one out, you could take the late debate and replace it with an automatic debate on those issues that come forward with petitions. Because I had asked at one point, what happens to the petitions that come here? Because we never see an automatic response to them. Petition gets tabled here, there's no requirement for a response, and that would be something that I'd like to see added, that if there's a petition, for example, in the Department of the Environment, that the minister within a couple of weeks would table a response to that petition, even if it's just to say this is what my department is doing on that issue, just so that there's that would really improve that dialogue, I think, between residents who are doing these petitions and government, because they seem to these petitions go into a black hole, and the only people that seem to do much with it are our library staff, who have now started putting the tabled documents and petitions online after they, a number of years later, and I know that they now have an archive of these online, which is a little bit ironic since we don't accept online petitions, but we take the petitions and put them online afterwards so that people can look them up. That, I think, would be, that in terms of addressing and having petitions addressed and be seen to be addressed by members of the public, thank you, Madam Speaker, that would be a big step, I think. That would be a step where we could say, when you table a petition here, whether it's 10 people or 10,000, the department will table a response. you know, and it doesn't have to be a long, detailed response. It can be, you know, one page, whatever the case, whatever that particular issue warrants. But I think at least there would be that connection, because that's what's missing in governance in particular, is that connection back to the public and knowing that when they do come and they do have their say here on issues, that there's some sort of feedback back and forth, and I think that would be very valuable. And you know, in a province of roughly 1 million people, we have that ability to do that. We have the capacity to do that. The ministers have the capacity to do that. And I know there's a number of ministers who will call individuals back themselves when they have time on issues, and I know that Nova Scotians appreciate that and have come to expect that. Modernizing government is a very, very important issue, Madam Speaker. As I say, there are a number of issues addressed in this bill that we obviously, in fact, there's none that we do not support in this bill, and the vast majority of them are ones that we've introduced before, and I would just remind that I wish the Progressive Conservatives had supported them when they were in government, because the numbers were there to actually pass them and have them law right now. But this is another day, and this is 2 years on, and hopefully the current government will support all or some of these items as well, because I think that there are some very critical moves. We've already heard the Premier say that there's a bill coming forward on the Elections Act on third-party advertising, so we'll see where it goes. Madam Speaker, thank you very much.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleagues from the Liberal and the NDP parties for their comments today. And I know the member from Dartmouth East has mentioned that the Liberal Party has introduced some of these measures previously, and that's fine. That's good. One of the things that people asked me when I was running for office, they said, Alan, don't bicker. Don't go to Halifax and show us more of what we see from governments when we see them on television. And I thought about that, and I thought that they're right, because the people are always right. And we should be trying to find ways to work together. I'll include myself in that mix as well, Madam Speaker. So I think it's, you know, I guess the question I would ask is, why don't we try to change? And why don't we find things that we can agree on and work towards them to make them happen? And I think it might even improve the relations here in the legislature, Madam Speaker, if we set out with some goals to try to come together on a few issues every sitting that we can come to agreement with. I think Nova Scotians would appreciate that effort. And Madam Speaker, you know, I know our colleague from Lunenburg had mentioned a number of issues that are important. Talked about health care, talked about autism and tax credits. Those are all things that are important. But I think first we need to look at our system. Before we get into all those matters and those measures that we talk about in this legislature, we have to do something to fix our system to improve people's faith in it. So that before we even get here to discuss those matters, Madam Speaker, that Nova Scotians feel like they are part of those issues. I don't see anything wrong with it, and I will ask the members of the legislature, because I am hopeful for votes of support for this bill and the passing of this legislation called the Modernizing Government Act. What is wrong with providing Nova Scotians with fixed election dates? Why not limit third-party advertising during a provincial election campaign? Why not require provincial by-elections to be called within 3 months of a vacancy and to be held within 6 months of a vacancy? Why not prohibit former MLAs from being involved in the activity of lobbying for 3 years after the departure from the legislature? Why not permit a person to vote in a provincial election at any polling station in the province on ordinary polling day that extends the period of advanced poll voting? Why not modernize government and use this Government Act, this legislation that we have before us, to require all polling stations in a provincial election to be accessible to the disabled? And why not require the Governor and Council to appoint a person who is disabled to be appointed to the Election Commission? These measures are designed to create a fair playing field, and they're designed to keep the focus, our focus, on the reason why we're all sitting here today in this legislature. And that focus is to represent the people of our communities. It is about the people having a chance to choose their representative in a way that is timely in the case of a by-election. Why not choose to make by-elections more timely for the people who need a representative in this legislature to represent them? Why not make that more timely? We look at the current federal election. We've had 4 elections in 7 years, where a lot of people are suffering from voter fatigue. We're used to it, Madam Speaker. We're used to politics and elections, but many people are not. And they wonder why they had to be going to the polls over and over again. And Madam Speaker, this is why we're speaking about this today, is trying to offer some focus for a government to have fixed election dates, so there's some more predictability. We can't eliminate elections happening in cases of minority governments, in all cases, but I think if there was something on the books to lock in place an election every 4 years, people would understand more, and they would appreciate, you know, if governments are put in, even a minority of governments put in, and people know that the legislation requires a fixed date, well, maybe people will say, we elected a minority government, and we expect those members that were elected to make that minority government work. At the end of the day, having fixed election dates is something that I think Nova Scotians want. And I think it's something that the members of this legislature should really consider supporting as part of this legislation. Because, Madam Speaker, sadly, some people have lost faith in us. And I think it's important that we appreciate all the people that support us in our own efforts to become elected. But many Nova Scotians are not as engaged. Maybe they would feel more engaged if they felt that choosing people and electing people into this legislature was done in a more modern way, and the activities that we do in this legislature are done in a more modern way. This legislation was introduced here to send a message to all those people who have lost faith, that we are listening, that we care about integrity, and that we're trying to make things better. For all its flaws, government is the way that we come together to make decisions about our province. What we are seeking today is the opportunity to build on the strengths of the democracy that was started in this province over 250 years ago. It doesn't hurt to take a look at things from time to time, Madam Speaker, and consider changing. Times change. Maybe we should be changing with the times. This legislature must be seen by Nova Scotians to be working in their interests. Madam Speaker, I believe we must begin by making these changes today because Nova Scotians want these changes now. These actions restore confidence. This House can begin here today by putting Nova Scotians at the top of the political spectrum where they belong. Madam Speaker.
I now recognize the honourable member for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it certainly gives me great pleasure to rise today and speak to the bill that is before us today. And I believe that the, you know, some of the previous speakers have. Oh, good. Madam Speaker, you know, being able to hear the previous speakers before me to discuss some of the issues that are before us. And one of the things, Madam Speaker, is around. I know we talk about third-party advertising in this bill, but you know, Madam Speaker, one of the things that that this government did, one of the very first pieces of legislation that we passed in this legislature is don't forget about the banning of union and corporate donations. You know, Madam Speaker, that is a very positive move that I think, I know certainly in the constituency I represent, is that, you know, when that bill was passed, that it was a very positive thing because it put all parties, maybe not even necessarily the parties that are in this legislature, but all parties in Nova Scotia an opportunity to have an even playing field. And one of the last points I want to make, Madam Speaker, is around the issue of by-elections. You know, previous governments, I know we've talked about in the past, that, you know, they would spend months and months with vacant seats. I would put the record of this government up against any other government around the calling of by-elections. I would ask the honourable member from Inverness to look back about when the previous member from Inverness decided to resign. That the previous member resigned and the by-election was called, I believe it was in October.
The honourable member for Hemis Plains, Upper Sackville has the floor.
I believe it was in October. In October, what date was that? October 20th was when that by-election was what happened, and so there have been many by-elections in the last 22 months. And Madam Speaker, I think that one of the things that we've seen is that this government understands the value of having representatives in this House. And Madam Speaker, I've heard on a number of occasions the importance, I know the Premier has said this on a number of occasions, is that the seats belong to the people. The seats that are, the 52 seats in this chamber belong to the people, and that is why this record of this government on the issue of by-elections is that it's been very positive move forward. So, Madam Speaker, with that, I take my seat, and I understand the opposition will call the next bill. Thank you.
I now recognize the honourable opposition, or sorry, the Progressive Conservative House Leader.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I did make a bit of an error when I called that first one. It was private members, public bills for second reading. And will you now call Bill number 18?
Now call Bill number 18, the Maintenance and Custody Act. I now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Act.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, with your indulgence, I'd like to begin with a brief introduction.
Okay.
Seated in the gallery is Tony and Faith Lindley, who are members of the Grandparents' Rights Group, and I'd just like to draw the attention of members of the House to their presence and thank them for being here today as we begin a debate on this important issue.
I welcome all. Thank you. And welcome all visitors to the galleries, to the legislature. I hope you enjoy your afternoon. Thank you.
Madam Chair, the issue of grandparents' rights has come up in this legislature and has a bit of a history here. And I do want to start by giving full credit to the member for Colchester North who first brought this issue to the attention of the House, who introduced a bill in a previous session. In fact, I hope she doesn't mind my sharing this, but I believe the first letter I got when I entered my new life was from the member for Colchester North asking me if I would meet with Ms. Pauline Glenn and the members of the Grandparents' Rights Group. And so I do want to thank her for that. She has a good bill on this same topic. I'm going to speak to the bill at hand, but I just want to recognize where it all came from, and appropriately so. I also know that the member for Cumberland North, my fellow Cumberland County Caucus member, it's a weird caucus since it stretches both sides of the House, has been asked on occasion to bring forward some legislation in the area of grandparents' rights, and I remain hopeful that that will happen, because it really doesn't matter where it comes from in this House, as long as we get to the right answer on this important issue. Madam Chair, if I could just share with the House for a moment my own experience with the Grandparents' Rights Group, a meeting that we held together in Truro some time ago. It was quite a moving experience, I can tell you, and I share that with all members of the House. To hear directly from some of the grandparents, this is an issue that actually affects thousands and thousands of families in our province who have been put through the ringer, the emotional ringer, over and over again, because they have no legal standing when it comes to access rights. To hear the pain, the financial expense, the legal expense, the ongoing battles in our confrontational legal system that we put people through, often to no good result, because there is no protection of access or insurance of access for family members to grandchildren, is very moving. And I would encourage all members to reflect for a moment on their own family experience, whether that be as a child who did have full access to both parents and grandparents and the difference it made in their own lives, or as a grandparent themselves, or as a friend or neighbor that has seen families ripped apart, as is too often the case in our province today, and the hardship and the heartbreak that can come from that unhappy circumstance. I would ask all members to reflect personally on this, because at its core, this is a very, very personal issue that afflicts too many families today. But we do have it in our grasp here in the legislature to do something about it. And so this particular bill, Madam Speaker, is centered around, first and foremost, what is in the best interest of the child. That is a legal term that we are happy to borrow from and apply that same concept to grandparents' rights. What's in the best interest of the child should be what's always under consideration, what's always top of mind, and that's what this bill does. In fact, Madam Speaker, I believe that calling it grandparents' rights, although accurate, is not actually the most accurate way we could describe it, because it is the child's rights that we are particularly concerned with. The child's rights to full and fair access to both a mother and a father when that is available to them, and also to their grandparents, who bring a lot to the upbringing of children today, who bring a sense of history, a sense of place, a sense of belonging, a sense of family. How valuable is that to the upbringing of a child? That child should not have that right to that kind of benefit to their upbringing ripped away. And so we are focused first and foremost on the best interests of the child. Madam Chair, what the bill does, in addition to allowing for grandparents to turn to the courts for access when that access has been denied, is actually trying to avoid the court time altogether, to avoid the confrontation, to avoid the cost, to avoid the heartache in the first place, by requiring at the moment of family breakup for the issue of access to grandparents to be considered and determined then, without the need to, at a later date when that access has been ripped away, to have to hire a lawyer, incur the expense, sue your fellow family members to enforce access. If we can avoid that unhappy circumstance, we do a great thing for the child and we do a great thing for the family unit. And it is with that in mind that the bill proposes that the courts be required to deal with the access issue, particularly with regard to grandparents, up front without being forced, so that that issue is resolved early. And the bill goes further and says such access shall not be unreasonably denied, because in the vast majority of cases, it is obvious that what is in the best interest of that child is that they have full and fair access to their grandparents, to all sets of grandparents, for all the reasons that we know from our own experience and from those that I listed just a moment ago. And secondly, Madam Chair, if we can avoid the courts altogether in any case, what the bill does is require lawyers, family lawyers, when they are engaged, it requires them to provide all of the mediation options that are available today to their clients, so that we can avoid the confrontation and the hardship, if possible, outright, by directing clients first and foremost through the non-confrontational mediation services that we have today in Nova Scotia. That if we can take this unhappy, unfortunate circumstance of a family breakup and deal with it in a way that avoids those hardships, that expense, that confrontation, which the courts are set up to deal with, then we have done a good thing right at the beginning. And hopefully children and mothers and fathers and grandparents and in need of mediation go through mediation and resolve their differences in a non-confrontational way without the expense of the courts, without the heartache of the courts. That is what we can do that is best for the best interest of the child. And that is what this particular bill proposes, in addition to ensuring that grandparents have the right to sue when all else fails, when mediation fails, when the confrontation is there, then they have recourse, as they should, to the courts. But, Madam Chair, Madam Speaker, surely we can do everything we can to protect families, to protect children, and allow for that child to grow up in a secure and safe environment, to allow that child to be looked after by its parents. But one of the realities of a modern family is that more and more grandparents are being called on to provide care directly to their grandchildren. More and more grandparents are involved directly in looking after their grandkids, as parents themselves are both working extra hours, traveling around, taken away from home for a variety of reasons, for volunteer reasons and otherwise. Grandparents are an important part of the upbringing of children today, whether they live in that house or not. So, what is in the best interest of the child? For sure, in almost all circumstances, for sure, it is in the best interest of a child that that child have access to the grandparents right from the beginning, without the need to rip families apart and sue each other. That's what the bill accomplishes. Madam Chair, in my last couple of minutes, I just want to point out that some aspects of family law are in the provincial control and some are in federal control. But at this very time, there is a bill before the federal parliament, Bill C-422, known as the Parenting Rights Act, that meshes very nicely with what we can do here in Nova Scotia, with what we have it within our hands to do here in this legislature to make this right. And so, Madam Chair, I am asking all members from all parties to come together and do the right thing for our grandkids, for our kids, and for our grandparents. I will point out that too often in this legislature, we would like to do the right thing, but cost is a problem, deficits are a problem, taxes are a problem, fees are a problem, and we use that as a reason not to move forward. We'd like to do this, but we can't because we can't afford it. We'd like to do that, but we can't because we have a deficit. This bill costs nothing. It is just the right thing to do. There is no cost. We have it in our power today as a legislature without any need to go and find a sum of money to make it happen. We can make it happen on our own. If all parties come together, if the government side comes together, as I hope and expect that both opposition parties will come together and do the right thing for our children and our grandparents, that's what this bill does. That's why I think we should move forward, because although it costs nothing, the value to our families and our societies is truly priceless. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I recognize the Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is a great honour to talk on this as Madam Speaker. Sorry about that. It is a great honour to come and speak on this piece of legislation and to talk on this particular issue. As a grandpa myself, and very proud to have that, I think the emotion is surrounded by this issue. There is nothing richer in my life, I think, than the experience and relationship I have with my granddaughter. The love, the security and friendship is something that I cherish and I wish to have till the day I leave this world. So there is nothing more important. And I am pleased today to rise to speak on the Private Member's Bill number 18, to amend the Maintenance and Custody Act to provide grandparents with an automatic right to apply for access to their grandchildren. As a grandfather, as I stated, I know only too well the bonds grandparents can have with their grandchildren. Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to making life better for families in Nova Scotia. I'm sure everyone here today would agree when I say that our children are our most important members of our family and our most precious asset that we can have in society. This government understands that grandparents want to have a relationship with their grandchildren. As I stated earlier, there is nothing in this world that I find richer than that relationship, beyond my relationship with my life partner. We also know that this is an issue that is near and dear to the grandparents' rights groups in Nova Scotia. This government also values healthy relationships between children and their extended families. But in order to properly facilitate those relationships, when access is concerned, we must remain respectful of the child's rights and best interest in the context of their family circumstances. Under the Maintenance and Custody Act, Mr. Speaker, grandparents are not automatically granted access to their grandchildren. However, all grandparents have a right to apply. Mr. Speaker, under the current legislation, grandparents who wish to obtain access to their grandchildren must demonstrate a significant relationship with the child in question. And every test is always done on the basis of the child's best interest. Madam Speaker, I'll get that right before the end of it, and that'll be a good thing. The test allowed each case to be reviewed and assessed based on case-specific circumstances and facts, each and every case, because the facts from one case to the other can be substantially different. And I thank my colleague next to me for putting the sign up there, Madam Speaker, and I will try and imprint that in my mind and periodically look over there to get that. As I stated to you earlier, it's such a pleasure to have your smile and stuff in the chair there. Much different than our colleague over there. So, but I value when he's in the chair. In some cases, I want to just get focused back here because this is a very important piece to be discussed in this legislature, and it's important to me personally, as I stated. The test may lead to a grandparent being granted access to their grandchildren. In some cases, it may not happen. Madam Speaker, I appreciate that in the cases where access is not granted, it would be very emotional and difficult for the grandparents involved. I can only imagine not having access and how devastating that can be. However, Madam Speaker, like all decisions relating to children, we must not lose sight of what is important, and that is the child's best interest and the child's rights, as my previous speaker spoke about. This is about the child. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, when it comes to legislative authority, we must ensure that the appropriate processes are in place so that legislation focuses on what matters the most, the child's best interest. Madam Speaker, we believe the Maintenance and Custody Act, as it stands today, does this, and it strikes a balance on rights. However, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, we have carefully reviewed Bill 18 as we recognize that it is something important to many people. As I mentioned earlier in this instance, we have the responsibility to ensure that any legislation or legislative change strikes the right balance between the best interest of the child and the wishes of the extended family. Madam Speaker, we must be mindful that in this province, parents have a right to decide who will have access to their child. Therefore, parental decisions regarding whom their child will have association must be taken seriously. The court only interferes in the most compelling circumstances, and when that is consistent with the child's best interest. Remember, it's all about the child. Madam Speaker, a review of the case law indicates that many cases where parents have been denied access as a grandparent, the courts have agreed with this decision. Also, Madam Speaker, providing grandparents with automatic access to their grandchildren when the parent objects could potentially cause a parent to become defensive and could create a conflict in the family and for the child. Madam Speaker, that would be that's one of the most important points that we need to look at in dealing with the best interest of the child. Currently, the legislation works to protect the child from those types of conflicts. Madam Speaker, we must put the rights and interest of the child first, and this government has confidence that the Act, in its current form, provides a balanced approach. That said, Madam Speaker, we understand the concerns around this important issue. Staff at the Justice Department are reviewing all family law legislation to determine, among other things, whether the words grandparent can be included in the specific provision. And I think words in itself, no matter what happens, will not necessarily make this issue go away. We need to look objectively and in a positive way, keeping in mind the underlying current that's critical here, and that's the best interest of the child. Given this, Madam Speaker, this government is unable to support the private member's bill. I want to deviate from some of my notes here for the next few minutes and say that I encourage people to speak up, speak out about what they feel is important in society. And as a grandparent, I know if I didn't have access, I would do whatever it would take to try and resolve the conflict at hand. Because what we're really talking about here when a grandparent is denied access is that we have a conflict. And in that conflict, we have to look at not necessarily to the law as being the answer, but how we can deal with that issue by getting mediation, by sitting down and understanding the custodial parent's interest. Why is that conflict there? What can I do differently? How can I make this situation better? Madam Speaker, I would do whatever it would take for me to have access to my granddaughter. It is that important. But the first thing I would do is to try and make sure that I build and maintain relationships so that I can overcome whatever barriers or conflict that may exist. That is not necessarily an easy thing to do in families when emotions and anger gets put in place. So it's a matter of trying, how do we bridge those differences? I encourage groups to consult in a wide range, everything from child psychologists to clergy within the community, within friends, of how to resolve the barrier. If we go to the courts to solve our issues, they are costly, they can cause trauma and lifelong harm. And remember, at the end of the day, we want the child to be in a loving, caring relationship and to have that security and support from all family members. That's part of where we're at here today, is that we know that in a perfect world, the family would be together. But in reality, we're human and we have different views of looking at the world, and that can create a number of different conflicts or perspectives on the issue. It's how open can we be? How flexible can we be? If it comes to the access to the child, it is what is in the best interest of the child. If I felt that my presence around the child would not enhance the quality of their life, then I'd really have to look at that seriously and say, I need to focus on what the interests are of the child. I won't waver on that point. And Madam Speaker, I had the pleasure of, as others here in the room, of listening to the previous speaker, and I'm looking forward to listening to the next speaker. I don't think that our position will deviate from one of us to the other. We all want to ensure that there's that relationship. If it means changing a word in the legislation, and that can be done in a way that doesn't take away from the custodial parent's right to monitor and to maintain security and safety of that child, then that's an important point to keep in mind. Words can be very powerful, and at the other time they can create damage. So we want to make sure whatever decisions we take, that we don't put a law or process forward that inhibits the clear focus on the child. And if we lose sight of that, as I stated from the start of my discussion here today, this is probably one of the most important topics to a grandparent, is just maintaining and getting the secure access. To see the child start school, to be a part, to hear the stories, and when they call you on the phone and tell you what they've done that day, to visualize the child being a young adult and coming to visit you as an adult, growing and seeing that maturation through time. I think to have that relationship, and as a grandparent to know that you have a friend, that you have someone that you love, and someone that loves you unconditionally. It's the unconditional relationship. I'm committed as Justice Minister to make sure that we build in our society access for all family members to our children. As I've stated before, our children are our most valued and precious asset and resource. They are the number one thing in our lives that are going to give us a future, that are going to build a future, and we want to contribute to that. And I think that the intent of all grandparents in regards to this matter, that they're sincere and committed to their grandchildren. What we need to make sure, though, in this process is that we don't lose sight of the fact that this whole legislation and whole process has to be done from the perspective of the child. And I don't say that in expense to the grandparent who's saying that their feelings and their emotions on this are not important. I think that they're extremely important and valued. And Madam Speaker, I really appreciate having the opportunity here to speak on this matter. It's important to me, and I want the group and the individuals in the House here today to know that this government is committed 100% to making sure that our children are given the best opportunities in life.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And in keeping with the topic today, you may find that I have to resort to my glasses as I read small print, and that's a sign, I guess, proud to be a grandparent. I am pleased to rise today and speak to Bill 18 and to acknowledge and thank the member of the leader of the third party for acknowledging contribution that I have made, I guess, to this cause, and also to acknowledge the member from Victoria the Lakes who came to me earlier on this session to tell me that he would be introducing a bill that focused on the same thing, and that being grandparents' rights, and as the Minister of Justice has said, and the rights of the child. It's not new to have this discussion on the floor of this House. And I think in one respect that's a good thing. I think the fact that a bill is coming back again and again would suggest that there is interest and there is a need. I first introduced a bill in October of 2009, again in April of 2010, again in the fall of 2010, again in the spring of 2011, and the bill that we're debating today, which was introduced in the spring of 2011 by the member from Victoria the Lakes. And I think that should be enough evidence to say that this is an issue of importance and that it will not go away. At the time that it was introduced in the fall of 2010, I spoke to the member from Cumberland North. I did that because I knew that some of the folks in the grandparents group were from Cumberland North. I spoke to him about that and about any difficulties that he or his caucus may have had with the bill that was before the House. And in that conversation, I said to him, and I will say publicly here, that it makes no difference to me which member from which party introduces a bill that will give access, and not unconditional access, but access through the courts to grandparents for access and visiting rights and privileges with their grandchild. It makes no matter of difference to me. And I told the member at that time that if he wanted to put in a bill, if there were things in the bill that I was presenting that were not supported by the government, put another bill in. Let's get a bill on the floor that we can all agree on, and that the outcome of that will be a piece of legislation that is in the best interest of the child. I would welcome that, and I would put that invitation out again. If there is a bill, and any amendments to the Maintenance and Custody Act that can strengthen that act, that will allow us all to come together. I agree with the Minister of Justice. Every one of us in this House remembers fondly our grandparents, and some of us now know what it's like to be a grandparent. So I think there's enough interest and enough emotion, positive emotion here in this House, that surely, Madam Speaker, we can come together to put forward a bill that will achieve what we are intending. And as I said, if the wording needs to be changed, let's get a bill here that will give us that wording. The intent of this bill is to strengthen the Maintenance and Custody Act. It is to make sure that the interests of the child are primary, of utmost importance, and that that we acknowledge the role that grandparents have and the rights that grandparents have and the access that grandparents should have with their grandchildren. And you know, Madam Speaker, the welfare of the child is language that's been used. And I believe that Bill 18 respects the welfare of the child. Our caucus will be in full support of Bill 18, and I would encourage all members of the House to give that support to that bill. One of the things that I believe some people are afraid of, Madam Speaker, is that this will give unconditional access, and that is absolutely not the intent of the bill. The language in the bill definitely does not give unconditional access. I would not support a bill that gives unconditional access, because whether we like to accept it or not, Madam Speaker, there may be times when grandparents should not have access. But this bill will allow the courts to make that decision. And that's where I believe that the interests of the child and the welfare of the child will be protected, because it will be the courts that will make that final decision. So I think the belief that perhaps this could expose children to grandparents whose intent and actions would not be in the best interest of the grandchild, that certainly will not happen with this bill. Another thing that this bill does is that when the judge is considering access, there are certain principles that must be respected. And that is in addition to the Maintenance and Custody Act. That's one of the things that we believe strengthens this. And I will, Madam Speaker, refer to those. The principle that a child should have as much contact with each parent or grandparent as is consistent with the welfare of the child. The language is there. The judge is being asked to consider that. That's one of the principles that the judge must follow. Second one, the importance of maintaining emotional ties between the child and the child's parents and grandparents. Again, that's something that this legislation is asking the judge to consider and respect. That's not in the existing Maintenance and Custody Act. That's why we believe this strengthens it. And the third principle is the willingness of each applicant for custody to facilitate the child's contact with each parent and grandparent. So when you have language like that, which helps define the actions of the judge when they are making decision, it does what I believe brings the focus onto the child. And it forces the judge to follow those principles when they're making the decision. It does not suggest for 1 minute that the judge has to grant undeniable access or access in a situation where it may not be in the best interest of the child. It's that kind of language that I believe strengthens it. Something that is in Bill 18 that was not in the previous bills, and I would acknowledge that that does again add more strength to it, is the mediation. And if there can be mediation, then there may not have to be the court case that determines access by the ruling of a judge. You know, Madam Speaker, this is not something new. This is something, and if you check Hansard, or if you remember the debate, when this was on the floor of the House last year, I made reference to the Law Reform Commission of Nova Scotia's report. And in that report, there were recommendations. And one of the recommendations was that the Maintenance and Custody Act needed to be strengthened. In fact, it said the report noted that relatively few cases will actually end up in family court as a result of the proposed legislation. And it states the cases that do come before the courts represent a very small percentage. There was some discussion last time on the floor of the House that this would flood an already overcrowded family court system. Well, the Law Reform Commission report suggests otherwise. So if there's a belief that this is going to open the floodgates and there will be all kinds of cases, family courts are not able to handle them, I believe we need to acknowledge the work of the Law Reform Commission. So if there is not a flood coming in, then we don't expect that that the impact on the courts will be minimal. But what we are saying is that the impact on families will be great. And I think we need to focus, as I've said earlier, on what is in the best interest of the child. We have to focus on what is in the best interest of the child, and we cannot allow situations to have emotions that are intense and that cause people. I heard the Minister of Justice to say he would do anything to have access to his granddaughter. I think we all would. What I'm suggesting and what I believe the intent of Bill 18 is that anything will be determined in the courts, and it will be determined with the best interest of the child as a priority. So, Madam Speaker, to conclude, I would like to say that our caucus is in full support of this bill. We would encourage all members of the House to acknowledge and support the fact that it does strengthen the opportunity, increase the opportunity, and I would close by saying I do hope that none of us are ever in a situation, but if we are, I would hope that the legislation that exists in this province will allow us as grandparents to have the access that we deserve to our grandchildren, and that is not unconditional. Thank you very much.
I recognize the honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise my place to speak to Bill 18, the Maintenance of Custody Act. Madam Speaker, this bill was introduced by our caucus because it will enhance the rights of grandparents and protect family ties in the event of a marital breakdown. Madam Speaker, this bill adds the definition of grandparent to the Maintenance and Custody Act. It requires the court to advise parties of the option of mediation. It provides for grandparent access orders. It sets out the matter the court must consider in making a grandparent access order. It requires a consideration of grandparent access in all access and custody orders, and it provides that a person who has custody of a child shall not unreasonably place obstacles to personal contact between the child and the child's grandparents. On the question of accessibility, Madam Speaker, decisions about grandparents' access to their grandchildren will be decided by a court based on the safety and the well-being of the child. First and foremost, Madam Speaker, this legislation puts the best interests of the child at the centre of any case of family breakdown. In most cases, Madam Speaker, children benefit from maintaining relationships with both parents as well as grandparents, and we want to protect that bond. Most often, Madam Speaker, grandparents enrich the lives of their grandchildren, and these children benefit from the experience and love of their older relatives, a benefit that will follow them for a lifetime. Most members in this House, Madam Speaker, all realize the positive effects their grandparents have had on their lives. Madam Speaker, if the safety and the well-being of a child is not at risk, then we must do everything we can to to ensure that the children's access to grandparents are protected. Madam Speaker, in Nova Scotia, we take pride in our close-knit families, and we understand how important family is to children. As a grandparent myself of an 8-month-old girl, I know what she has done for me, and it's my hope that the advice and love that I show to her will help her in her journey through life. Madam Speaker, we've been working with grandparents' right advocate Pauline Glenn on this legislation. She has been trying for 11 years to get this legislation passed, guaranteeing grandparents' rights. And Madam Speaker, I'd like to just read a couple of quotes from Ms. Glenn that was in the Amherst Daily News that I will table. Ms. Glenn says, and I quote, "Grandparents are such an asset to the children and the parents. If a grandparent sees that a grandchild needs a coat, they will go buy one, taking some of the financial burden off the parent." Another quote, "It's the children who are suffering. They miss so much in their lives when they're not allowed to be with their grandparents." End quote. Madam Speaker, Ms. Glenn recognizes that if it weren't for the NDP, this bill would be law. But last time, the government killed the bill on the floor of this House. Let's hope that doesn't happen this time. As a matter of fact, Madam Speaker, on August 25th of 2008, the NDP leader and then leader of the opposition wrote to Mrs. Glenn in a letter that states, and I quote, "I applaud your association for the work it's doing on behalf of grandparents as it relates to having access to grandchildren." And I will table that, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, Pauline is a constituent of the member for Cumberland North, and I know that she's been disappointed with the inaction of her MLA, the government member from Cape Breton North. In the past, Madam Speaker, that member had appeared to support the changes that we're proposing today. But in November 2010, the member for Cumberland North claimed that giving grandparents these rights would only bog down the courts. Madam Speaker, I think it's a bit shameful for the member to put paperwork ahead of the well-being of a child. But the Progressive Conservative Caucus, Madam Chair, wants to protect that child, and we believe that this legislation will do just that. This is not the first time this bill has been brought forward in this legislature. The honourable member from Colchester North has mentioned the many times that she has presented, and we thank her for that. Madam Speaker, I was disappointed, and our caucus was disappointed, when the NDP refused to support the bill last fall. And they say they're committed to families. Well, Madam Speaker, I hope that time has permitted them to come to their senses, and they will stand up with us in support of this legislation. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I now recognize the Honourable Progressive Conservative House Leader.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. That concludes the business that we had for today, so I'll pass the reins back over to the Government House Leader.
I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I want to thank everybody that participated in the debate today, and the House Leader from the Conservative Party. Madam Speaker, excuse me. The hours for tomorrow will be 10 a.m. To 5 p.m. After the daily routine and question period, we will go into debate on supply. And appreciating, Madam Speaker, that there are many holy holidays coming up this weekend with Passover and with Easter. We would hope that once we resolve Committee on Supply, we may get out a little early. So with that in mind, I will call the hours from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. and wish we to now rise.
Thank you. The motion on the floor is that we now rise to meet again tomorrow between the hours of 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. All in favour? Those opposed? The motion is carried. It's now the moment of interruption, and I now call under Rule 5.5 as read earlier today, a resolution put forward, excuse me, thank you, put forward by the Honourable Member from Guysborough Sheet Harbour, and it reads, therefore be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly recognize Earth Day on Friday, April 22nd, and do what they can to get the message out about this important day of recognition. I recognize the Honourable Member for Guysborough Sheet Harbour.
Madam Speaker, it is an honour to rise in my place today to speak about Earth Day and the initiatives our government has made to protect and preserve our Earth. Earth Day will be celebrated on Friday, April 22nd, and as the Minister of Environment said earlier today, Earth Day is a time to remind ourselves that our Earth is a precious resource that we all have a duty to protect. Madam Speaker, Nova Scotians care about the environment. Past governments talked about the environment, but they left the hard work, the work of making real change, for someone else. And proudly, Madam Speaker, that is where we, this NDP government, comes in. Since coming to office, our government has been taking on that hard work. It isn't our approach to claim credit before we see results. Unlike past governments, we focus on practical progress, not empty rhetoric. I want to recap some of our environmental accomplishments and let all Nova Scotians know that this spring, many of the initiatives we have begun working on behind the scenes will begin to come to fruition. Madam Speaker, I am proud that our government is known for our climate leadership. The previous government set targets, then sat back and watched greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. We're taking action to meet and exceed the targets set out in Nova Scotia. The targets set out in Nova Scotia. Our government set the first hard caps on greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. Nova Scotia is the only province in Canada to place hard caps on greenhouse gas emissions in the electricity sector, an initiative that earned us awards at the United Nations Conference on Climate Change in Copenhagen. As a strong believer and supporter of the environmental leadership opportunities in Nova Scotia, our Premier was the only Premier in Atlantic Canada to lead his provincial delegation. And Madam Speaker, just yesterday, the Minister of Environment announced that as a result of our leadership and additional measures, we are well on our way to meet our greenhouse gas reduction targets by 2020. Madam Speaker, this is truly something all Nova Scotians can be proud of. Madam Speaker, when we came to office in 2009, wind power construction in Nova Scotia was stalled, and 90% of Nova Scotia's electricity came from coal. Past governments didn't have the political will to fix these systemic problems. Our government's renewable electricity strategy will turn around this dependence on coal. This aggressive plan will take us to 25% renewables by 2015 and 40% by 2020, something Environmental Defence applauded as one of Canada's top 10 green accomplishments for 2010. And Madam Speaker, I am pleased to know that by the end of this House session, that number will be law. The renewable electricity strategy isn't just about big, ambitious, or aggressive goals. It's also about a progressive community feed-in tariff, a world first, which will deliver benefits of green power that will stay in our communities. Madam Speaker, these measures are significant, but I've got more. As government, we got tough on environmental regulation. One of our first legislative acts was to enact a moratorium on uranium mining, an action that previous governments refused to take. We showed leadership on this issue, Madam Speaker, because we know it's important to Nova Scotians. Previous governments refused to show leadership even as municipalities moved to restrict pesticides. So our government made the tough decision and put in place legislation and regulations restricting non-essential pesticides in Nova Scotia. In fact, Madam Speaker, these rules take effect this spring and will protect families, especially small children. Madam Speaker, our government protects the environment and the areas and things in it that are important to Nova Scotians. While previous governments shied away from an indefinite ban on oil and gas exploration on Georges Bank, our NDP government, in the fall 2010 legislative session, introduced legislation ensuring the long-term protection of this sensitive marine area and traditional fishing ground. As we protected Georges Bank, Madam Speaker, we have also protected our forests. Guided by the hard work and priorities of the Colin Stewart Forest Forum, our government made an historic $75 million purchase in Crown land. This has allowed us to add high-value conservation lands to our Crown land base that will be critical in meeting our goal of 12% protection. In early 2009, then Premier Rodney MacDonald said this kind of land purchase couldn't be done. But Madam Speaker, as we celebrate Earth Day and strive to protect our environment, it was done. Madam Speaker, some of these decisions were not easy, but our goal is to find balance, though it's a fact that not everyone is happy when tough environmental decisions are made. But we won't shy away from them. We'll take on the hard work and make the right decisions for Nova Scotians. You see, Madam Speaker, our government believes the environment is everyone's responsibility. And when given assistance and the right tools, we can all do our part. In my constituency of Guysborough-Sheet Harbour, the municipality of the District of Guysborough has taken on a role of their own in environmental protection. They have introduced a 5-year strategic plan with ambitious environmental goals and visions. One of the goals, Madam Speaker, is to improve environmental sustainability by implementing more environmentally friendly practices in the community. And thanks to some help from our government, Madam Speaker, in July 2010, Guysborough County received $93,861 to install solar hot water panels that will help heat the Shetabacto Place swimming pool and the Shetabacto Education Centre public school. The District of St. Mary's is doing their part as well, Madam Speaker, by constructing a new energy-efficient administration and library building, and they are working to reduce electricity usage at the Sherbrooke Sewer and Water Utility with energy-saving upgrades. These projects were possible with our help to the tune of $138,450. The town of Canso, with the assistance of this government, installed a number of LED streetlights, and they, the citizens, are experiencing the savings and the satisfaction that comes with the knowledge that they are doing their part for our precious environment. And I must take a moment to talk about a very exciting project in my area that once again proves working together can achieve great things. In response to a call for bids in December 2008 for smaller, community-based wind projects, Watts Wind Energy Incorporated, a joint venture between Renewable Energy Options, Seaforth Engineering Group, and Eon Wind Electric, installed a wind turbine at Watts section in Sheet Harbour. Madam Speaker, the turbine just started whirring and electricity is being created as we speak. Madam Speaker, I am proud of the steps that the people of Guysborough-Sheet Harbour have taken to protect our environment, and I'm proud of what our government has done to lead the charge. As I conclude, I must mention again in this House the leadership our government has shown on a project that will change the way our region accesses power, and that is the Lower Churchill project. And I understand I'm out of time, so I will end by saying, Madam Speaker, I trust everyone will take time out to celebrate and enjoy Earth Day.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I was beginning to wonder if the member was going to mention too much about Earth Day, because I think the motion before us was what we could do to improve the environment individually. But in light of the member's comments, I'll begin by spending a few moments just responding to his comments. I agree with him that that there have been some moves. We certainly support the move to 40% renewable, although I'd remind that member, as I've reminded the minister, it's actually not in the legislation that's been put before the House. So that legislation actually doesn't, in fact, have anything to do with the 40%, although we certainly hope that that target is reached. You know, Madam Speaker, it's a little bit of a sad day when we have some of the most respected environmental groups in Nova Scotia coming out with statements this week and last week expressing dissatisfaction at this government over their environmental record. And in fact, a couple of them have done, in fact, the Ecology Action Centre, and the exact quote I used in the House the other day, stated that this government has essentially undermined the economic goals and Environmental Goals and Economic Prosperity Act. Thank you. Thank you. Nothing like a nice long name for an act. You know, Madam Speaker, yesterday it was announced by the Minister of the Environment that the greenhouse gas emission numbers have reduced in this province, and obviously that's good news. We learned later that that was actually only from power generation, and 4 studies, including information released in the past week by the Government of Canada, have actually indicated that the total greenhouse gas emissions for Nova Scotia have increased at a rate faster than the GDP in Nova Scotia over the past 5 years. And that's from 4 different sources, the Pamina Institute, the Government of Canada, see if I can remember them all. Larry Hughes, who's a local individual, well-known scientist at Dalhousie, and the 4th one was the Conference Board of Canada. And all 4 put out information over the past month indicating that Nova Scotia's total greenhouse gas emissions have increased. So while the power greenhouse gas emissions related to energy production have decreased, and I certainly agree with the minister, and I do think that's a good thing. I don't want to take away from that, because that is a good thing. That is only about half of what's generated in the province. And so I think we need to be concerned about that because it's widely accepted, and I think it's possible the minister used this in his own remarks about a year ago, that we had this date of around 2015 that it's widely expected that world greenhouse gases need to level off and then decrease after that if we're to actually reverse some of the trends. And while our total greenhouse gases continue to increase, that's unlikely to happen. And I might remind all members of the House that that leaves us with less than 4 years to achieve that target. And that is an enormous target to hit, especially as we predict that when you know, Nova Scotia Power in their briefing earlier today on power rates talked about the fact that actually, as it happens, one of the reasons they managed to hit that greenhouse gas target on energy production was because of the recession. And that's not a reason. Now, obviously, some of it was because of renewables coming online, and I don't want to take away from that, but some of it was because of decreased demand for electricity due to the recession. And obviously, that's not the way that we want to hit our greenhouse gas targets. We want to become more efficient. I also want to continue to express concern about the fact that mercury emissions, the mercury emission targets have been delayed. And a lot of talk has been given about the fact that those mercury targets will be increased in the future, but the numbers that the department have given are identical to the numbers that the ministers were talking about for the next phase anyway. So it's not really that much of a change. And when you look at the fact that New Brunswick and particularly Alberta, which is heavily reliant on coal energy, has actually exceeded the mercury targets, we have to be very concerned about that, because mercury is a bioaccumulative substance in the environment. It's a substance that builds up. We know that salmon fishermen in Nova Scotia have expressed concern about that. Trout fishermen have expressed concern, in addition to more generalized environmental organizations. That is of deep, deep concern, Madam Speaker, because it is one of the most dangerous substances that is emitted from power generation in this province. And what the government has done is effectively said, you know, we're going to allow that to be relaxed. And that may have been, in 21 months, people will have different opinions on which was the worst one, but I personally feel that that was the single most environmentally damaging decision by this government, was to do that, because that's not a reversible decision. That's not a decision that you can change things later on. I think we should also recognize some of the things that private industry are doing. And let's be fair, some of them are for cost savings, and you know what, that's probably going to be the leading driver in terms of environmental change, is some of the cost drivers. And I believe it is FedEx, but it may be one of the other delivery companies in town, has switched to all electric vehicles for their deliveries within HRM. And I believe they've done the same thing within CBRM and so forth. And I think that's a major move, because that's something that actually measurably reduces the emissions from transportation sector. And the transportation sector currently is responsible for 29.2% of all greenhouse gas emissions in Nova Scotia. And as the energy production emissions reduce, that 29.2% number actually will increase unless we decrease the emissions from transportation. And that's why we really need to be looking at things like a provincial strategy on transit. We are one of the only provinces in Canada that does not have a transit plan that supports capital and operating costs of municipalities across the province. And obviously, we're standing in the municipality with the largest transit system, but we are not standing in the municipality with the only transit system. Nor are we standing in the municipality as the only one that wants to expand one. And I know there's Truro, for example, I met with the mayor of Truro a number of weeks ago, and they are looking at establishing a transit system, and I think that's a very good move. It's a very exciting move. But those transit systems, especially in more marginal communities, are only going to survive with stable long-term funding. And I know that we look to the federal government for some of this through gas tax funding and other measures, but there are opportunities by the province to become, as I say, one of the only, if not one of the only provinces now left in Canada that does not provide an operating assistance program for transit systems. That's the kind of thing that's going to make a real measurable difference in the environment. There are other things too. We really need to look at, I know a number of members of the House on all sides had the opportunity to participate in the Drive Wiser program recently. And the interesting thing about that is they pointed out that when you look at your carbon footprint of a vehicle, replacing your vehicle may actually have a higher carbon footprint than actually just driving your existing vehicle better. And if you think about that, that makes a lot of sense. You think about the carbon footprint and the energy involved in producing a new vehicle and so forth. And if you have a vehicle, regardless of if it's giant or small, that's less than 10 years old, the odds are that you can improve your carbon emissions more by driving better. And some of them were obvious, but some of them were not. And I would encourage everybody, if they get a chance, to participate in that. We also need to be looking at how we deal with situations. I raised the other day the issue of how do we deal with the mercury vapor and the phosphor or high pressure sodium lights that will be removed as we go to the LEDs. The LEDs are a good idea. It's a good idea to change the highway lights, but we still have to dispose of the other lights. And we have to have a plan in place to do that. And we haven't seen a plan in place to do that yet. And that's going to be significant when you're dealing with the number of lights we have across this province. So on the one side, that becomes a good announcement, but on the other hand, there's a big hole. And so there are similar ones, there are similar issues like that we do need to address. It's how do you ensure that the measures we take to improve the environment do not have a short-term or even long-term negative effect. And that's one that could have a long-term effect if it's not addressed right. And it's one that can provide economic opportunities in Nova Scotia. We have some of the most amazing and innovative work going on. A lot of it actually is in the Truro area at the agriculture